Good morning everybody and welcome to this week's webinar. Today we are looking at the technical consultation following the Housing Standards Review. My name is Katie and I'll be looking after you this morning. Again, if you've got any questions then you can send them over to us. This morning we will be looking at what the proposed changes are, how the housing standards will affect you and when these changes are likely to take effect. To get in touch with us this morning, you can either raise your virtual hand and ask us a question at the end, or you can actually use the question box to type in your questions throughout the session. What we're saying is because this is referring to the consultation, you can send us questions, but you can also use the questions facility to actually comment on the consultation, because we will be compiling a response to actually send after this event in preparation for the end of the consultation. So again, feel free to use the questions to give us any comments that you have. We are live on Twitter again this morning. We have the hashtag, as usual, CBuildECPD. Your presenter this morning is Kevin Blunden. He's the Deputy Chief Executive for CABE and he looks after things in terms of all technical aspects. So I shall hand you over to Kevin.
Good morning. All right, let's just progress me onto the right slide. There we go. Okay. So before we actually start, one of the things that's fed back from one of our previous webinars was that people actually would like to have a little bit more information about who's attending today, what fields they're operating in. So before we actually start going into any of the detail of the consultation, we are going to ask you what you do. Now, the quick poll questions only have a limited number of options, so there will be a further question in the feedback at the end which will give you a bit more flexibility in terms of what you can say you do as a job description. But at the moment we're just going to ask you very quickly to tell us which of these fields you feel you actually work in. Hopefully then when we feed it back and we start dealing with questions, you as attendees will get a feel of where the audience sits and where the questions are coming from. Okay, so it's voting on clients. You've obviously all got the hang of this. Great. Okay, just a few more seconds. I think we're more or less there. Okay, I'll close the poll out at that point. Okay, and now hopefully you can see the results of that poll in front of you. Not surprisingly, there's a big proportion of people dealing directly in building control attending the webinar today. And then the rest of you are design, if you like, on the other side of the equation, where you have to understand and advise clients in relation to design and other issues as far as the regulations are concerned. Quite surprising, there's actually nobody here from planning today, and obviously some of these standards will have an impact on the planning system. Right, okay, so back to where we were, and hopefully now we're back with the presentation in front of you. To set the scene a little bit, the Housing Standards Review was carried out against a backdrop from the government of deregulation, seeking to remove a vast number of standards that were being inconsistently applied across the country, with developers having to meet different standards on different occasions and no real consistency. At the same time, the government undertook a general red tape challenge to reduce the regulatory burden across all sectors, not just construction. A formal consultation on the housing standards took place between August and October of 2013, and it's the output of that that's led to the current proposals. Now, since March, the government's been using the deregulation bill to amend the 1984 Building Act. And the main purpose of this is to set within the Act what are being called optional requirements. Now, this doesn't mean that the designer and the developer have the option as to whether to apply these standards or not. The optional standards are a different set of minimum standards that will kick in when the local planning authority sets a condition that requires this higher standard. That is a fundamental change to the principles of building regulations and needs an amendment to the Building Act. And that's being achieved by the deregulation bill, which is currently going through the parliamentary processes. In asking for the optional requirements, the planning authorities will have to justify that there's a need for the higher standard and that it is viable. So there are some quite rigid rules on how they demonstrate it's viable. Subject to parliamentary approval, the government intends to get the amendments to the building regulations in place in early 2015 before an election, and those will include the optional requirements. Now, it's possible that some of the changes to the building regulations will come in April, but it's far more likely now that we'll see the bulk of these changes in October. That's right, slides didn't want to move on, there we go. So, a couple of wrongs and rights. Where we are with the consultation at the moment, the consultation that we're in the middle of with the government, which closes on the 7th of November, is not about the principle of whether these standards should be introduced. That's pretty much set. They are coming. What the consultation is the technical requirements themselves and the proposed approved documents. And as I said, the other wrong of the situation, if you like, or the misunderstanding, is this term optional requirement, because it's not optional. Once it's set in planning policy, it will become the minimum building regulation standard for that development. So the optional requirements, they're not an option to be considered by the designer, the developer or the client. They will be enforceable under the building regulations and will have to be applied by both local authority building control and approved inspectors equally. The circumstances where the local planning authority can apply an optional requirement or a nationally described standard are clearly set out in the guidance and the criteria that the government will be issuing. And therefore, the requirements as an optional standard will have to be part of the planning framework locally and will be subject to this viability test. This means that a planning authority, if it's opting for an optional standard for development, will have to demonstrate that there's a clear need for it, and not simply a blanket approach to all development within their area. The government see this need as something that is needed to have on a local basis rather than something that is nice to have. So the higher optional standards are only applied where they're absolutely necessary. It will also mean that once national standards are set, planning authorities won't be able to impose any other standard in relation to housing where they overlap with these. So there will be one national standard set, and that's the only one that can be dealt with through the system. In essence then, there are a number of different areas and standards that are being included in the proposals. They relate to access issues, water efficiency, introduction of national minimum standards that will be contained within the building regulations. There's also some changes in relation to refuse storage to reflect where the industry actually sits at the moment. And new building regulations are proposed in relation to a national minimum standard level of security for new homes, which will form Part Q of the building regulations going forward. There will also be a new standard for space, so minimum standards for room sizes. This will replace a raft of existing standards that are out there, but this is the old standard in this package, in that this won't be a building regulation standard. It will sit as part of planning framework, it will be imposed as a planning condition, but it won't sit as a building regulation. Having said that, the government still see the potential for building control to be involved in this standard, and they feel that building control services, both local authority and approved inspector, may offer to check compliance with this standard at an additional optional cost. Okay, that sort of set the scene, so I'm just going to ask Katie if we've already had any questions, if there's anything we need to consider at this stage.
Hello, just a quick question from Steve about, I know you're talking about regional variations, but is this referring to just England? If so, what is our understanding of the regional context, for example, Wales?
Yes, at present these proposals are for England. It is quite probable that Wales may adopt a similar approach very shortly afterwards, and there is a separate consultation starting in a week or so in Scotland to look at some changes to standards north of the border. But because of the way in which devolution has occurred for Wales, it's no longer the case that every time something changes in the English standard it automatically filters through to Wales. Having said that, in most of these key areas I don't see any reason why they won't be adopted by the Welsh Assembly, possibly at the same time, possibly shortly afterwards. Okay, is there anything else at this stage, Katie?
Just one that's just popped in. It
Fine.
just says, is the use of the word optional misleading? What are your thoughts on that?
It is very misleading. I think, to be honest, what we should be looking at, instead of talking about optional standards, it would be much easier to talk about a baseline minimum standard and then a higher standard. Now, the optional is being used because that's what's used within the guidance documents with all the documentation that's come out of the Department for Communities and Local Government, and that's how it will be perceived out in the industry, but it will be an option based upon the local planning policy and the planning conditions. There is no real option, and definitely when it comes to actually implementing this, the planning permission will determine which standard applies. Building control will then have to implement whichever standard that is. Now, they will still have the ability, as we do with building regulations at the moment, for building control to interpret whether a compliance is achieved with a standard. But it will be based upon a 1 or a 2 or a 3-tier standard of compliance. And as we look at the various parts in a moment, we'll see that in relation to some parts of the regulations, we're just going to have 1 standard, some will have 2, and as far as access is concerned, we'll probably end up with 3 different standards in terms of access. Okay, so perhaps if we move on and pick up some questions later on. How is this all going to work with the building regulation and planning link? There is an intention that once the regulations have been laid, but before they come into effect, the approved documents will be published, and this is possibly why we might be looking at October for actually implementation rather than April. At the same time as this, there'll be a written statement from the Planning Minister which will go to all planning authorities, which will basically say that they cannot impose conditions other than the new housing standards, and laying down the ground rules for when they can ask for the higher optional standards, having demonstrated viability. At that point, the system will probably then come into operation, which may well be in October next year. Normally, building regulation changes occur in April or October, and we don't expect that change. It is very tight to get some of these things introduced for April, particularly with the amount of legislation going through Parliament before the end of this government. So it's far more likely that the details of the regulations will be laid, it will be there set in stone that it's coming in, but it may well be October before it actually comes into force. So as far as the process is concerned, the anticipation is that the planning authority will identify the standard that applies in its policy. It'll then talk to the design team, hopefully at a pre-application stage, to make sure that that optional standard that they've identified in their policy is still appropriate for the specific development. The standard will then form a condition of the planning approval. Now, at the moment, the government's view is, having got your planning approval with that condition attached, it's for the designer and the developer to tell building control which standard they're working to. Now, in reality, it's highly likely that building control will need to see some verification of that standard. They may not be part of the same local authority, it may not be an internal process, so the easiest way for building control to be sure which standard they've got to implement is to ask to see a copy of the planning approval with any conditions. At that point then, building control will control development at the same way as present, simply using the standard dictated by the planning approval. And if there isn't a separate optional standard identified, then we'll go to the baseline standard that are dealt with in building regulations. it's still the role of building control to determine if the work complies, and it will still be the role of building control to deal with any enforcement issues, whether that's soft enforcement by negotiation or whether it actually is enforcement through the local authority process through the courts. It will still be building control that enforce the issue. And it won't be the case at that point that there will be an argument about whether the planning policy should apply or not. That would be debated at planning stage should any appeal be lodged. I suspect that at some point the planning authority will look to see a copy of the building control completion certificate or final certificate so that they can be assured that the optional standard has been met for the development. So, hang on, gone too far. That's better. It's probable that the process of reviewing and updating the local planning policies will not be completed in the interval between issuing the approved documents and the ministerial statement and the actual new regulations coming into effect, because planning policies tend to take much longer to actually go through a process, update and amend. But nevertheless, planning authorities won't be able to ask for alternative standards. So after the implementation date, it will only be the standards that are referred to. One of the casualties of this approach is the Code for Sustainable Homes, because a lot of the new standards overlap with parts of the code, and because the government takes the view that we're working towards zero carbon homes under Part L by 2016, they feel that the code is no longer needed and that it's basically too onerous to be asking for properties now to be dealt with under the code, whereas we've got other standards instead. So future planning approvals will not be able to require a percentage of homes or a number of homes to achieve a particular code level. Once the project's underway and it's already got that condition, then that will have to follow through. But in essence, the Code for Sustainable Homes will be phased out. If we start looking at some of the details of what's proposed, the government, in terms of access, is looking at 2 additional optional requirements for accessibility. We'll have what we currently have within Building Regulations ADM, which is what's termed now Category 1 visitable dwellings. The idea being that's our baseline standard that applies everywhere. The optional standards will then be available to local planning authorities in setting their housing policies, with particular reference to meeting their current and future needs and the wide range of people out there in the community, including older and disabled people. So there's a mandatory baseline standard of access, which will now be this visitable dwellings Category 1. The intermediate level is an optional requirement for accessible and adaptable homes, which will be Category 2. And as the name suggests, what we do is we build in a higher level of accessibility with greater provision to allow for adaptation in the future. And then the third requirement is for fully wheelchair accessible housing design. Now, as an optional requirement, this won't apply across the board. It may not apply to the private for sale sector because obviously what we don't want to do is be designing a lot of properties with standards that will never actually get used. So looking at each of these in a little bit more detail, as I say, the existing requirements under Part M are intended to be the new Category 1, the default standard. This applies in most situations, and it means that realistically we can get visibility with little adaptation. The properties are constructed with facilities, they may not be, it saves us putting in facilities into a property that may not be used by the end user. So this is probably the standard we will see for the private sale sector. Category 2 is almost equivalent to the current lifetime home standard. It's referred to as accessible and adaptable buildings, and the idea is that it's relatively easy to change something going forward if we needed to put in something like a through floor lift. Category 3 is a wheelchair user dwelling, and it needs to meet the needs of being adapted for a wide range of wheelchair users. The guidance in the approved document for Category 3 makes a distinction between reasonable provisions for dwellings that are wheelchair accessible and where they're adaptable. so that they can meet future needs. So it's quite common that wheelchair housing is not initially occupied by a wheelchair user, or that specific needs of a wheelchair user are not known until late in the construction process. And that's particularly the case in sale for private rental or a private sale. The cost of installing through-floor lifts and accessible bathrooms and kitchens can be high, and if we put these into a property where there isn't actually a wheelchair user, there is the risk that they'll just be removed by the incoming owner. So in reality, we may well see those limited to a very few cases. So in terms of category 3, the wheelchair user properties, the higher standard, it actually breaks down again into two different options. Regulation 432A triggers a requirement for the home to be fully wheelchair accessible. So that will include features like through-floor lifts, accessible kitchens. But there can also be the issue where we actually have a property that is adaptable. So those facilities aren't built in, but they are capable of being built in fairly easily at a later stage, so that we can easily adapt and put in a through-floor lift, an accessible bathroom, and a kitchen. Right, so another quick question, and this question is based upon part of the consultation. The consultation asks where the dwellings are fully accessible, should they include one or more of the following at the initial fit-out? So it's saying, should it have a shallow insulated sink, height adjustable worktops, height adjustable sinks, plumbing that's installed to work with height adjustable sinks but not the sink itself? So clearly here there are a range of options. What I'm going to ask you here is to tick all of the ones that you think should be built into the design for a fully accessible property. Now obviously not all of them will apply, because if we're having height adjustable sinks, then the fourth category of plumbing to allow for it isn't included, because obviously that just means we would just provide the plumbing, not everything. So quick question then on that, which of these should be included, and you can tick as many boxes here as you like. Okay. Right, I think we're probably just about there. So if I let you see the results of that, hopefully that's now popped up on your screen. Interestingly, I think maybe as we'd expected, things like height adjustable worktops, height adjustable sinks in a property that's intended to be fully accessible obviously makes sense, and that's where the bulk of you have indicated. And I think that probably follows through in what the government are expected to see, but this actually will form part of the association's feedback to the consultation. Right, I've got another poll coming up in a second, but just before I do that, I'm conscious that there's probably a few more questions coming. So Katie, have you got any other questions at the moment?
Hi there. John is asking why there are complicated differing requirements for the same feature. So for example, access and stairs, that it could potentially be confusing, if you're with me?
Yeah, I think it will be confusing, because the issue will be that on any particular development, it may well be that there are some properties being constructed at the baseline Part M standard that we've sort of grown up with, and there may well be other properties on the same development being built to the higher or the intermediate standard, similar to the lifetime homes, and then maybe even more that are fully wheelchair accessible. It is a tricky one in terms of access, because it will have to fit back to the local plan, and the local plan will very much have to look at what the needs of the community are in that area. I personally think the number of instances where fully wheelchair accessible homes will need to be built from scratch will be fairly limited, because in essence that will probably only apply to developments that are being particularly targeted at those end users, whereas the need for maybe accessible might be a little bit more far-reaching. But the important point with all of these standards is that before the planning authority can impose it, they will have to determine a need and show that it is actually viable, because what we don't want to end up is building properties with all these features that the end users don't actually want.
Will the planning authorities be given guidelines on what to do?
Yes. There will be guidelines coming out to the planning authority, which I think is one of the reasons that we will be looking at it in terms of an October implementation rather than April, just to give time for all of this guidance to get out there and explain to them exactly how they work it out. There will be very strict rules in terms of whether something is viable, so it's won't just be a local whim that determines whether it's viable. There will be strict national guidelines for planning authorities to determine the viability of a project. Okay, if we move on then and look at another quick question from the poll, again it's from the consultation, and this time it's actually asking about material alterations. The building regulations basically say that once you've done alteration work, the building shouldn't comply to a lesser extent than it did before you started. So in other words, you shouldn't make matters worse in terms of access. The consultation is actually asking, should this principle still continue to apply? So should we apply access issues to material alterations to properties, or should we remove that? So it's a straight three-answer question: yes, no particular view, in other words, I'm not sure, and no. So this one, let's launch that question. Okay. So as I say, should we continue to apply the regulations to a material alteration? Okay, the results are coming in. Yeah, we're more or less there. Everybody voted, I think. A couple more seconds. Okay, I think we're pretty much there. I'll close that off and let you have a look at that. And from a personal perspective, I think no great shock there. Most people are saying yes, we should still apply it, and that's the sort of common sense logical answer, because in reality there is no point in having a requirement in if then we go and make an alteration and we don't make sure that that's still maintained. Right, moving on from access then to look at some of the other bits and pieces that are required. Space standards are coming in as a national housing standard or a minimum standard. There's currently a wide variety of space standards required by local authorities, and they vary between affordable housing, those intended for private sale and rent, right across the whole remit, and they reference a whole raft of standards that are out there, and various planning authorities are looking for different standards. So they tend to vary in terms of host, so to speak. All the different tenures, so whether they've rented, private, affordable housing and the like. And this standard will detail a methodology to how it's calculated. Okay, so in reality, it should make life much easier with a set standard across the industry. So the base standard will set out some standards for internal storage. It will also look at bedroom sizes and stipulate some minimum sizes. And in the draft standard that's out there, it actually goes as far as to indicate what are the standard size of bed we'd expect in a double bedroom to help in the design. Some of the current standards also deal with minimum ceiling heights, but they can vary between 2.1 and 2.7 meters. And really the only requirements in building regulations at the moment actually derive from the heights of ventilation in general rooms, and that comes down to 1.75. So it becomes a practical issue rather than anything else. So there will be some minimum standards for sizes of rooms, but it will not be an optional requirement in building regulations. It will be imposed through a planning condition, but it's not a building regulation, it's not enforceable by building control. It will be continued to be the role of the planning authority to assess and discharge the condition relating to compliance with the space standard. Now, the government has said that they're interested in exploring alternative effective methods of compliance, particularly where there may be a role for building control bodies. And I think what they're saying here is that they don't really want to bring this in as building regulation, but they acknowledge actually that building control may be better placed to actually do the check to see whether these standards are achieved. So building control won't be able to actually assess compliance and give a building regulation approval in relation to space standards, but the government do sort of expect that both local authority building control and approved inspectors might offer a plan checking service against space standards as an additional bolt-on service. But it does make it clear that they might well want to levy an additional charge for doing this. Okay. So on that question then of should building control actually get involved in checking this standard, again a question from the consultation. So yes, building control should be involved, no they shouldn't, or I haven't particularly got a view. And this is, it's not necessarily should they be involved, it's should the government continue to look to see whether we should get involved with it. So this consultation, it's just this question, it's just a straight yes, no, not particularly bothered. Okay, great. And to be honest, there's a slight advantage on the numbers of responses that said yes, but it's a fairly even split, to be perfectly honest. I think the natural issue is that it may be more problematic for maybe an approved inspector to liaise quite so closely with the local authority planning department, and at the same time, although the government clearly feel that there'd be the ability to charge extra for doing this, in the real world we probably all appreciate that a lot of the time clients expect a little bit extra for no extra cost. Right, so moving on from space standards to security. Security's been on the agenda for building regulations for an awfully long time, since the Secure and Sustainable Buildings legislation. So it's been with us in the background for a long while. The government considers that there should be a minimum standard for security applied to residential accommodation, and it's suggesting that that's based upon the British standard PAS 24. PAS is obviously a publicly available specification. That standard sets the requirement for door and window assemblies, including testing and specification locks, as well as the robustness of the doors and the windows themselves. By moving to a consistent standard, it's hoped that costs could be reduced and robust levels of securities will be included as the norm. Now, the government do recognise that the standard under PAS 24 is a slightly higher standard than common industry practice, and most of the industry at the moment sets down or follows the guidance set down in the National House Building Council standards as a basic standard for domestic dwellings. But the PAS 24 is what is recommended by the police as a minimum standard, and also reflects what came out of previous housing quality indicators. So the intention with security is that there will be a new Part Q of the building regulations. So even more straightforward question with this one, again from the consultation, so one we will be responding to. Do we think that security standards should be implemented as a national mandatory requirement? Yes or no? Okay. Right, so that then roughly 2/3, 1/3 split, to be honest, as to where it sits. There is always the question with a standard, whereas we're introducing a standard that actually the industry is working towards anyway, do we actually need to regulate for it? And as with anything, it has to go through an impact analysis, decide what the cost benefit is, and part of that process also has to look at whether the building control system has the ability to take on yet another check and another set of skills, if you like, to assess some of these things. So those will be taken into consideration. So the results from that will feed back into our thoughts on the consultation. Okay, at this point, Katie, are there any other questions at the moment?
I've got a few comments coming in that we can include as part of the response. Just a note, really, regarding your recent poll about, you know, should I'm just trying to find it now, the building control be inspected and stuff. And obviously we found out at the beginning we've got a high percentage of building inspectors sort of attending the webinar, so there could be an element of waiting there.
Yes, no, obviously with all of these things we do have to bear in mind when we do a formal response to a consultation where the bulk of our members sit, what their interests are in the industry. And because we as an association have quite a diverse membership, sometimes our responses have to reflect a range of views. One of the things we are doing at the moment is, as well as preparing the response on behalf of the association, we are also working with the Building Control Alliance to do a cross-industry response in terms of getting an answer from all sectors. But yes, we are conscious in the association we have to balance all of our members, not purely the building control element. Excuse me. Right, moving forward then. The next standard that's being considered is that of water efficiency. Regulation 36 currently requires all new dwellings to be designed with a water consumption of no more than 125 litres per person per day. And that standard is also reflected in the current Code for Sustainable Homes. The only difference between the two is a slight tweak on how water outside is considered. The intention going forward is to introduce an optional requirement of 110 litres per person per day, so a higher standard. And this would require, again, a condition through the planning process to identify that this higher level is the one that's appropriate. So to help with that, the government's working with the Environment Agency to look at evidence of where local water resource issues occur and where that tighter standard needs to be applied. So the planning authority will very much be guided by water resources in the local area. Bear with me one moment. Sorry about that. One of the other knock-on effects that is included within the approved document that's going to do with water efficiency is an alternative to using the full water efficiency calculator to determine compliance. The alternative approach will basically be on a fittings approach, so there will be limits on flow rates through taps, through shower heads, capacities of water systems, sizes of baths. And if the designer sticks to those model sizes, there will be no need to run the calculator to demonstrate compliance. So it's trying to make the process of compliance somewhat easier than having to run a calculation. Something the government are quite concerned about is the concept of bin blight and a range of dustbins and black bags dominating street frontages, which can lead to antisocial nuisance like odour, litter, potentially vermin. And it has sort of become worse because we've now got numerous bins for numerous purposes. So you may well now have 3 or 4 different wheelie bins, you may have boxes for recycling, things may still be in different bags. So the guidance in approved document H will change in 2 ways. Firstly, there's going to be additional guidance to make clearer the importance of good design of waste storage. The second relates to the existing building stock, and the government believes it would be beneficial to make sure that refuse is considered when a material change of use takes place, as well as in the construction of a new building. There are also some minor changes within approved document H to try and underpin some of this. Currently, the wording could suggest that the requirement for waste storage at the moment doesn't apply to recycled materials, and that's not intended to be the case. So the waste storage requirements will be clarified to make it clear that it does also apply to waste that's going to be recycled. Secondly, there's going to be some guidance on design solutions to deal with things like local amenity, vermin, litter and the like. And then finally, there's going to be an updated reference to the British standard for waste management as an alternative approach under Part H. Right, that's run through most of the content of the consultation. So what I really want to do now is to throw it open for any questions that we may have, any comments that you want to make, so that we can try and address those and take forward as many as possible into the response that the association will be putting forward to the consultation. So Katie, have we got anything else that you're picking up on at the moment?
Again, not really in the sense of questions that we can ask now. Like I say, we've got quite a few more sort of specific examples and questions, but that's more really what we would put together in the collated response. So if anybody has got any questions, now's your time to type.
Okay.
Oh, I've got one. Here we go. Are the standards likely to apply to change of use?
At that stage, that's what I was intending to say. So now, Katie, have we got any further questions?
Hello. You have covered off a lot of the questions that have come in. So, for in example, the guidance being open for interpretation and the fact that there isn't a code of practice in place, that's kind of a common theme for questions. There's also, again, a common theme has been about the projects spanning over the 2 periods, which I know you have just covered, and also a lot of conversation about CSCS cards and whether they're actually required. Now, obviously, that comes down to difference of opinion, but an interesting discussion.
I think with the CSCS cards, I think the critical thing there is are you safe when you go to site? As a professional visiting the site, if you are left to wander the site unaccompanied, then it's absolutely critical you get a sort of day-to-day induction just to tell you, oh, there's a hole over there or that scaffold's incomplete when you get to the site. But the majority of professionals, when they visit the site, actually get accompanied around by somebody who's trying to guide them at the right things to look at maybe and avoid some of the other bits. But it's really the contractor's issue to manage, and if they can deal with it by accompanying people around the site rather than asking for a card, fine. As I said, there is a growing body of opinion in the industry that we recognise that most professionals don't need to undertake a separate test. Now, what is critical to getting that recognised by the powers that be is to make sure that within all of the qualifications that lead to somebody being professional, there is relevant information about health and safety. Okay. Anything else?
I've got a question. It's just come in, actually. I'm just reading it. And it says about, is there anything from a colleague who works in education about that can be sort of told to students about the changes? Any sort of straightforward, I suppose, nuts and bolts guidance as to how this is going to go forward?
Well, the first thing I would say to that, and as you will probably say in a moment, is that this webinar will be available on our website, so people can always look at what I've said here. If you want it more from the horse's mouth, there is some basic information on the Health and Safety Executive's website, but at the moment, because the regulations haven't actually gone through, it's not fundamental and detailed. There's draft regulations there, but there isn't a lot of explanation behind it maybe. But what we will see certainly over the next 6 months across the industry will be a whole raft of information coming out of the industry to guide people on their roles. There are two groups that are producing most of the information at the moment. There's a group called CONIAC, C-O-N-I-A-C. They are working on producing the guidance. That's a cross-industry body dealing with health and safety. And there's also the Construction Industry Council Health and Safety Committee. Both of those bodies will be putting out information over the next few months. And particularly, I think, in terms of those in the education stream, some of the targeted guidance will be on the right pitch at the right sort of level for student entry into the industry to give an overview of the regulations. Okay.
Okay, again, Kevin, there's a